Welcome back to the Star Spangled Beauty Quilt Along. We are on the week of June 9th. We're going to be working on the 8-point stars. There's 3 of these, and the Patchwork Flag. I've already prepped all my batting and put fusible on my fabrics. I'll do 8-point star number 1 with you on camera. 2 and 3 I'll do off camera, and we'll work through the Patchwork Flag from start to finish. For the Patchwork Flag, I went ahead and printed out pages 42 and 43. We're going to navigate through this together and figure out which sections I'll be working with. There's also choices for the designs on the stripes. Look for the Patriotic Border 5 file, KDQ 411. You can print this. This has several pages. We'll work through this as well, and we'll be looking at how to size our borders, which file we want to select, and how to use this for our flag block. Then there's also this file called Stars Quilting KDQ 406. This has to do with the corner blue portion of the patchwork flag. Let's start with 8-point star number 1. I've cut my batting, I've got all my fabrics, I have the fusible on the back. The instructions for this block are on page 40 and 41. This block is done in 2 halves and then sewn together. Now I am using the background quilting. That's going to be done after the piecing portion of the block. The first thing we're going to do is piece the blocks in the hoop, and we'll end up with 2 halves. These will be sewn together, and then the background quilting will be put on top, and then we'll trim the block at the end. We're on pages 40 and 41. We're going to work through the first of the 8-point stars. I'm on my Baby Lock Meridian. I need to find my file. It's on a USB, Star Spangled Beauty, and this is under embroidery files. You're going to use the exact same file, this 8-point star, it looks like half the star, for all 3 of these. You do this twice for each star. Bring this one up. I need to set that, and then I hit embroidery, and now I'm ready to go. The thread colors here are completely irrelevant because you're going to be doing this again for 3 stars, and each star has its own thread color and 1 color for each of the stars. The embroidery part for the 8-point stars can be done on a 5x7 hoop, and the batting does not go down at this point. The quilting is going to be done after we do the star halves, and then you're going to sew your star halves together, and then we'll do the quilting. We're going to start with the background placement line. Once your placement line is stitched, lay down your background fabric, cover that placement line, tack that down. The next step is to stitch the template. For this star you have 2 fabrics. In this block, this is fabric 1 and fabric 2. Does it matter? Not really, as long as you do both sides the same. So if I accidentally put this down as fabric 1 and this is fabric 2, when I make the other half, I would want to do the same thing because the other half is going to get flipped and attached to this. If you're not using the fabric kit, you could also do 4 different fabrics for this part. Take your first fabric, cover this top square right side up with your fabric. Go ahead and center it on there. Once the square is covered, we're going to be stitching the trimming and placement line. It stitched the little line right there. You want to trim any excess fabric off. I could have slid that down a little bit. It's not going to matter. As long as it got caught, this is all going to get trimmed. Trim this little bit off. And then grab your next fabric. Take your fabric 2 square, center it along this line, right side down on the bottom edge, like that. So basically what you have is fabric 1 and fabric 2 lined up right sides together. Then you'll stitch that down. Once you have that line stitched down, you want to flip it and press it. You can finger press it, you can roll it. I have my little clover roller here. I've shown that before. I like to use that. If you want to get up and iron it, do that. Just remember to take this off your machine and then go iron it. Don't iron on your machine. That would be bad. It doesn't say to tape, but I want to make sure this little fabric square down here stays. I'm going to add just a little piece of tape right there, and then we're going to stitch the fabric tack down line. It's going to go around both of these squares. They call this line the inner squares tack down line. Once this line is stitched, you want to trim everything outside of that line. So take your hoop off your machine, take your tape off if you added tape, and trim off everything on the outside. Everything is trimmed. This is going to go back on your machine, and we're going to stitch the star points placement line. You can see the star point placement line. You want to take your star point fabric, make sure this is covered. I went ahead and put a little tape on either end. It doesn't tell you to tape it, but I want to make sure that it stays nice and flat and my fabric doesn't shift. I have my fabric down. We're going to stitch the star points tack down line. Once this is stitched down, go ahead and remove your tape, and you want to trim outside the lines. You want to keep what's inside the triangles. Those are your star points. Here's what it looks like after you've trimmed all the extra. Put it back on your machine, and we're going to do the last step, which is the star points decorative outline. That's all there is for this half. What you need to do now is do the same thing again. Lay out all your fabrics exactly the same, because once we're done, these are going to get trimmed here, and the other side will get flipped, and we'll put right sides together and stitch them together. So make your other half for this and do your star 2 and star 3, and then I'll come back and we'll do the trimming and the sewing and then the quilting. Here are my two halves. First thing we want to do is trim away this excess stabilizer. I've trimmed away the excess. The next thing we're going to do is use this line right here. They call this the background fabric tack down line. And we're going to trim the left side only of both of these. So you're going to trim along that line like that. You're going to do that to both of your blocks. I'm going to grab a ruler. I want to trim along this line. Line my ruler up right along with that. Go ahead and cut this one like that. And I'm going to go ahead and cut the second one. Flip your star so it looks like this. Then we're going to put them right sides together and stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance on our sewing machines. I'm sewing these all together at the same time. This is block 3. I pinned it just like I pinned the one I just showed you, and everything shifted. It's a little bulky and a little difficult to work with. I've seam ripped it twice. What I ended up doing, I finally got this to match. You'll see that only part of it is sewn. I put both sides together, but I looked at this part right here, and I lined them up and pressed them down, and I held it with my finger. I took all the pins out, and then I stitched until I just ran over that and opened it and checked. Now it's lined up. Now what I'm going to do is look at this section and this section. I'm probably going to line up these two. Let me turn this over. These two parts right here, make sure they are correct, fold it, stitch this little bit, I'll open it again, and then I'll stitch the center. I was having a lot of difficulty lining this up. Another thing you can do is you can do a basting stitch, so a really long stitch, open it, see if it matches, and if it does, run your stitch right over it. If not, you can pull out the basting stitch and try again. Here's the next step. I lined that up. You can see I still haven't stitched the center. These are both lined up. I'm going to line this up and tack that down just across the center, and then I'll unfold it. If everything looks good, then I'll run one more seam like this. I tacked down right there. That's much better. Now everything looks like it lined up. I still have two parts of the seam that are open right here and right here. All I did was tack down all the points to make sure everything lined up. Now I'll go back to my machine and stitch all the way down. I think I'm going to do this process for all 3 of the stars. Here's the final result from the tack down, tack down, tack down sew. That came out great. I think part of the problem is, as I'm sewing, this stabilizer is very slick and it's shifting under my machine. That's probably part of the problem. This looks good now. I'm going to do this to all 3 of my stars, and then I want to take it to my iron and press. This seam is really bulky. I'm going to go ahead and press open. Normally I do not press open, but these seams I'm going to press open, because if you go to one side, this is really bulky, and we still need to take this back and do the quilting over it. I think pressing it open is probably going to be the way to go for this. Here's the one we're working on. Still not perfect. Right about here it's slightly off. I'm good with that. Definitely had better results tacking down each point. You can even start in the middle, which is what I did with this one. I did the center first and then each side. I've got all three of these done. I'm going to take them all to my ironing board, and I'm going to press all of these seams open. Then we're going to come back and do the background quilting. I've got all my star blocks pressed. I pressed this seam open, and then I went ahead and gave them all a good press from the front, made sure I didn't have any puckers or wrinkles. We're on the top of page 41. I'm going to do the optional block by block quilting for all of my stars. All three stars use the pearl color for the quilting. We'll work through star number 1 together. I'm going to use an 8-inch square hoop for this quilting design. Load your stabilizer, hand tighten, and screwdriver tighten. The quilting designs are a 6 by 6 design. When you get to the end, the trimming instructions, it says to trim to 6.5 inches square. If you haven't cut your batting yet for this step for the quilting, add an inch. Trim yourself a 7.5 inch square of batting. We need to get our quilting file for star number 1. Back to my USB, Star Spangled Beauty. I'm looking for KDQ 407. And I need the 6 by 6 design right there. Going to go ahead and set the design, and we're not adding anything additional. We're ready to go. Make sure you've got the pearl colored thread on your machine. The first thing to stitch out is the batting placement line. Get your batting, make sure to completely cover that placement line, and then we'll stitch the batting tack down line. Once your batting is tacked down, you want to trim away all the batting that's extra on the outside of that line. Once your batting is trimmed, you want to stitch the fabric placement line. Now you have your little box here outside your batting. We need to do our best to center our star over that box. I have this on my lap. What I did was match these. They're very close to exactly matching. And then I taped the top. I can pull this back and I can look. Looks like my corners are matching. This line here matches. Fold it down, have a look. Looks good, going straight, going straight. I'm going to add the tape and add the tape. That's probably as close to centered as you can get. I have all my tape in place. Now I'm going to stitch the tack down line. That'll be another double check that you can look at after the tack down line stitches to make sure your block is centered. Once you stitch that down, I can look and I can see both stitch lines because the first one is in red and the second is in beige. They're pretty close to exactly matching. There's no need to pick anything out or move the block. It's good to go. I'm going to go ahead and stitch the quilting. I have all my stars quilted. We're going to go ahead and trim these blocks before we move on to the next blocks. The instructions say to trim them to 6.5 inches square. I have my 6.5 inch orange pop ruler. I'll go ahead and center that on the block, and then I'm going to take the next larger ruler and put that around it so I have some extra space to hold down the rulers and keep them from sliding. If you have some thread, like I do here, I've got a little red thread, although I cut right on the thread on this side. You can check, grab a ruler. It's going to fall within the 1/4 inch. So when we put our quilt together using the 1/4 inch seam allowance, this will disappear in the seam. I don't have to pick it out. I'm going to trim my other 2 blocks. Here's all my star blocks. I'm going to put them in their bag to keep them clean, and that way I'll know where they are when it's time to assemble. The instructions for the flag block are on page 42 and 43 of your book. I went ahead and printed these because there's several steps to this, and I want to make sure that I mark what I'll be doing today. I am doing the block by block. My fabric is already cut to the block by block specifications, and I am doing the background quilting, and I'm using the embellishment kit. We're going to start right here and read through our choices. Right here at the top it says if using the optional star buttons, which I am, and the block by block quilting, complete the following. And it tells me I have part A, option 1, block by block quilting, part B, optional block by block quilting, then it says block by block trimming instructions, sewing the block. Let's get into this in detail. What I did was go through and mark all of these steps. The first thing is to make sure fabric is cut for the block by block. I did this in the very beginning when I prepped all my fabric. We'll be starting part A, option 1, block by block quilting. We're going to bring up this background design, and this is for this part of your flag. We're going to stitch this out just like that, and then we're going to go down to the step here that says star buttons, skip to part B, instructions. Because we are not stitching the stars, we're using the buttons. Once we've done our background quilting on the star portion of the flag, we're going to move on to part B for the stripes portion. Part B is our block by block quilting, and it gives us the colors and talks about stripes 1 and 3 and 2 and 4. And it gives us the files to use. This is where the Patriotic Border 5 printout comes in handy. Right here on the front page, you can see the different quilting designs that are offered and the different sizes that are offered. There's the words and the florals. On their flag, they used florals on the 2 red stripes and words on the white stripes. If you like this look, you would do exactly this. Maybe you don't like the words, maybe you want them all floral, maybe you want to add words to the red. You can customize this portion. The one thing I do notice about this, the bottom stripe says land that I love, then there's a star, and then it says America, and it kind of cuts off. When I get to this stripe, I may try to do something different and see if I can move it and adjust it. The instructions tell you, if desired, iron fusible backing to the wrong side of the star's background fabric. Because I'm going to be adding quilting to all of these, I actually put fusible on the back of every piece of fabric. I don't want to take a chance that I get any puckering with this. I have my light mesh cutaway in a 5x7 hoop. We're going to quilt our stars. There's a separate file for this, the Stars Quilting KDQ 406. This walks you through the process of how you do the background quilting. We've been doing that all along. If you want more of a step-by-step, you can certainly print this and refer to it. If you haven't cut your batting, go ahead and cut your batting. You can see the quilting file is 3.5 inches square. I had some scrap pieces. I've got a 5-inch square of batting here. Should be plenty big enough. Let's get our quilting file. USB, Star Spangled Beauty. I need KDQ 406 3x3 Stars Quilting. 406, it's the only one. Go ahead and bring that up. I need to hit set and then embroidery. It shows some different color threads. You only need one color thread for this. It looks like it is the cobalt thread. Get that on your machine and we'll walk through this stitch out. The first thing we're going to do is stitch our batting placement line. Go ahead and cover that line with your batting. Then we'll stitch our batting tack down line. You want to trim off the extra batting. Next you're going to stitch out your fabric placement line. Grab your stars fabric. Make sure you cover that fabric placement line with that, and then stitch the tack down line. Once that's tacked down, we're going to go ahead and stitch our background quilting. That's it for this one. What I found interesting was the tack down only went around once, but we are going to be sewing this together as part of the flag. If you watched my video for the C to C block, you remember I had the fusible on the back of that as well, and it looked like some of the fusible poked through with the quilting. Kind of the same here, but in this instance, I actually like it. It lightened up that dark thread a bit. I can really see the quilting on this. I'm really pleased with the way that turned out. If you don't like the way this looks, don't put fusible on the back of it. The instructions say, if desired, iron fusible backing to the wrong side of the star's background. I did. Again, I can't help but wonder if there was a dark colored fusible, if that would illuminate it. But in this case, I really like that. You can actually see the detail really nice. And when I sew those stars buttons on, it's not going to get completely lost in the background. We will trim this to 3.5 inches squared. I'm going to set it aside for now and trim all parts of this block together. Our stars are quilted. It's time to move on to the stripes. I went to the Borders and Sashing information chart, page 5 of the Kimberbill Quilting Patriotic Borders. I started here for stripe number 1. It says fabric cut width 2 or 2.5 inches, and it said to look for this file. I went ahead and loaded this file, and then I stitched out the batting placement line. Here's the batting placement line on 5x7 if you can see it. This is really narrow. When you cover it with your fabric, I can see I have 1/2 inch on each side. You are going to lose 1/4 inch when you stitch this into your quilt, but then that leaves another 1/4 inch with no quilting. So if we go back to the chart, you have this fabric cut width column. I went down this way, saw 2 or 2.5. Oh, 2.5, that's what I need. If you go further down the page, you have 2.5 again, 2.5 or 3. So here's 2.5. And it gives you another file name, 2x7B. And then this third column here is the finished width of the quilting. The finished width of this quilting is 2 inches. We're working with a 2.5 inch strip. We know we're going to lose 1/4 inch on each side when we sew it in, which leaves me with 2 inches visible. I'm thinking I want to use the larger choice because I want the whole stripe to appear quilted. I don't necessarily want a little bit here and a little bit here to be unquilted. And this is a floral design for this stripe. I think I'd rather err on the side of caution and maybe even have a little quilting caught up in the seam line and go with this bigger file. Let's use this one. I'm the guinea pig. You get to see what happens and what the final product looks like before you stitch yours. But I'm going to go with the larger selection and see how that looks. I already stitched out the smaller batting tack down. I'm going to go ahead and start with the same piece. You're never going to see that. I'm not going to pick it out. So when I stitch down the next batting tack down, you'll see this little one that I already stitched and then another one. I'm back at my machine. I need to bring up my files on my USB. And the file we're looking for stripes 1 and 3 is called KDQ 411 Border Patriotic 5 Floral. So let's do KDQ 411. I'm on stripe number 1, floral. Looking at my chart again, since I already looked at this one and decided I don't think it's wide enough, we're going to go down to this one, 2x7B. Look, it's right there, 2x7B. We don't need to add any additional files to that. One thing we can see by doing this is that first file that I picked, the narrower one, versus the one we're actually going to try. You can see the difference in the width. If we put our fabric strip down, that's much better. We're going to be working with this larger box. There's that 1/4 inch that's going to get taken up in the seam allowance, and my whole center of this fabric, this should all be quilted. I don't think that it would be wrong to make this selection, but if I went forward with that after I stitched it, I would have a little bit that didn't get quilted. Let's grab our batting, and I did just use a batting scrap. Make sure everything is covered, and we're going to stitch our batting tack down line. Go ahead and trim away your excess batting. Once your batting is trimmed, we're going to stitch the fabric placement line. The fabric placement line has stitched out. Now you'll notice I have my fabric, which I cut to 6 inches. When you put it down, your lines are further than, this is longer. I think that's because this is a border file. we need to tack down our fabric. And one of the things I'm looking at is the position of the needle. I think this is going to be a real tight tack down. Now remember, I went with the bigger width for this strip. That might be why. The tack down lines are only going to go here and here. With the border instructions and from the video I watched, they tell you to put a roll of the paper tape underneath this, but I think I'm going to center it and just put a little piece of tape over it. I'm not going to roll the tape. I'm just going to put a piece of tape down. We'll see what happens. And that right there is why you never get up and walk away from your machine. I saw that coming. I was watching as it was advancing and thought, oh, I should have taped that. I was able to pick it out, not a problem. If that happens, what I did to pick that out was I took the needle off and it had only stitched a few stitches, so not a big deal. I decided to leave that in the video so everybody can see that mistakes happen for everybody. I'm going to lay this out again. I'm going to cover each edge with tape because this line is starting past my fabric. So it's going to trail over the edges. Let's make sure to cover these completely. Now everything is really covered. Everything is stitched. At this point, I think I'm going to trim away the bit of tape that's here so it doesn't quilt over the tape. It'll be really hard to pick that out. We are on to stitching the quilting. And again, this is my first time trying something like this with the border files. I would love to know in the comments below if you use the same size file, if you use a different file. Any helpful hints or tips, not only for me, but anybody who's watching, please leave them in the comments below. Let's stitch the quilting. I do think I picked the right file size. Let's get in close and have a look at that. If I went with that smaller width file, I would have even more of a gap on the top and the bottom with the quilting. And that would have been fine. We're on stripe number 2, the words block. I'm going to use this 2.5 or 3 inch measurement like we just did for the floral. It has me looking for file 2x7A1. On their example, they centered and stitched out the word America with a star. Let's see if we can figure that out. Make sure you change your thread color. We need to pull up the border files that have the words in them, the KDQ 411, and this time we want words. The file I've selected per the chart is 2x7A1. Let's find that. Here it is, 2x7A1. And it is America and the star. We're going to go through the same steps as before. I'll set all of this to music. We're going to do our batting placement, batting tack down, trim the batting, fabric placement, and fabric tack down. I'm putting on my tape. I'm putting it closer to the edge so I don't have to go back and pick out the tape from the quilting. This one looks like, how odd. This one looks like it fits. The floral one clearly didn't fit. This looks like it fits. Okay, go ahead and put your fabric down, tape it. Make sure it's taped really well before you do these 2 tack down lines. The tack down lines have stitched. They did not cross over the edge of the fabric like with the floral quilting. Let's go ahead and stitch out the quilting. This was perfectly centered. Let's move on to the 2 bigger stripes and see what happens. Let's look at our file selections for our larger stripes. My batting for these is 9 inches long. I used scrap batting. I made sure it was long enough to use with the piece of fabric. The fabric is actually cut 9 long, 2.5 wide. Let's look at the floral. When you look at the width, you've got 2.5 or 3, which is definitely what I want to do. I don't want to do the 2 or 2.5. I want the 2.5 or 3. And then you look at the batting size. There's a by 8 and a by 10.5. Well, mine is 9. When I go across And I should have done this with the first two. This gives me the embroidery field in this last column here. 2.5 by 7 or 2.5 by 9 and almost 9.5. This is why that floral one extended beyond my fabric. This is going to be the one that I'm going to select, because if I select this file, my embroidery field is 2.5 by 7, but my fabric strip is 9 inches long. So this would leave a gap on either end. This embroidery field is 2.5 wide, 9.5 long. My fabric strip is 9 inches long, so this is going to go over the edges of my fabric strip for the floral quilting. For the longer strip that uses the words, I'm picking the 2.5 or 3, and again my batting is about 9 inches long. I used a piece of scrap batting. You have a choice here, 8.5 or 9.5. Two file sizes, and then I went over to this last column and looked at the embroidery field. This one is 2.5 by about 6.5, and again my piece of fabric is 9 inches long. That's going to leave a big gap on either end. This file, the embroidery field, is 2.5 by just over 8 inches. There's a little bit extra on either end, but if you look at the next size up, the embroidery field goes to 11.75 inches long. Your fabric strip is 9 inches. This would stitch over the edges. I'm going to go with this file for the words. Let's stitch out stripe 3, the floral. I'm going to look for the 2 by 10B. This is 2.5 by almost 9.5 long. So again, this is going to stitch past our fabric. Let's bring up the file. I need the KDQ 411, and we want the floral. And I'm looking for the 2 times 10B. 2 by 10B. Go ahead and set it ready to embroider. And my batting placement line, this is the scrap that I had. It's really close to the top and bottom. I went ahead and cut a new scrap. I don't want to have to deal with taping the batting. So we'll put that down, make sure it's completely covered, and I'll save that other scrap for another time. Got my fabric and my fabric placement line. My fabric's going to be shorter than that placement line because the embroidery field is longer on the file I selected. I'm going to place my fabric down and tape my fabric just like I did before. I taped it very close to the edge so I won't have to trim anything off or get my tweezers this time. If you don't want to have to do this, if you haven't cut your fabric, you can cut it longer. I did cut mine per the block by block sizing instructions. Or if you already have this cut, you can always use the smaller file. I just wanted to fill as much of this fabric as I can with the quilting. Let's go ahead and stitch out the tack down line. It looks good. It does fit barely between the tack down lines. Let's go ahead and stitch out the quilting. It's hard to see the quilting. It went barely over the edges. That turned out great. Do you want to see something funny? That's the second time I did this one. I made a mistake the first time. I put it on the wrong fabric. So now I have this little strip. I'm sure I'll figure out something to do with it. You can see the quilting on this one. This is the fabric you needed for the words. Luckily, there was enough extra in the fabric kit. I could cut a brand new strip, so I was able to do the words on another piece of fabric. I'll put this in my oopsie pile and see if I can figure out what to do with it. We're on our last stripe, and remember this is words, not floral, and I'm going to use the 2 by 10A, and that has an embroidery field of 2.5 by 8.04 inches. My fabric strip is 9 inches long, so this one won't run over. Bring it up off the USB, and we want the KDQ 411. I'm looking for 2 by 10A words. It's right there at the bottom, 2 by 10A. This says My Home Sweet Home. In the example, they use The Land That I Love with a star and then America starts running off of it. I'm going to go with this one, My Home Sweet Home. This is going to fit on that stripe. I'm not going to have half a word. I like the sentiment on that. Let's stitch out this one. I'll go ahead and move through the batting and the fabric and all the placement stuff. I'll set that to music. Getting ready to quilt the words. They'll easily fit on this fabric strip. This strip is actually about 9.5 inches, so I had a little extra wiggle room. Let's go ahead and stitch the words. That came out great. I'm going to go ahead and set this aside. The next thing we're going to do is look at the trimming instructions for this and then assemble our flag. You should have all your components now to make the flag block. Everything's quilted. We're going to trim off the extra stabilizer. The first thing I'm going to start with though is my star block. It says to trim the star block to 3.5 inches square. I happen to have this nice little square ruler. I bought a set of the square ones. They come in 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, 5.5, and 6.5. It came as a bundle. I think I had a gift certificate one year. Great purchase. I can see my star block through there. I'm going to get my rotating cutting mat and trim this. We're right here, block by block trimming instructions. After quilting, trim all stripes to the standard size listed in the materials needed. This is page 43. Go back to page 42. On page 42, here's the standard size. Gives you everything that you need to trim, although we already did the fabric stars, so that has to be trimmed to 3.5 inches squared. Stripes 1 and 2, 5.5 by 2. Stripes 3 and 4, 8.5 by 2. Let's start with stripe number 1, trim to 5.5 by 2. The first thing I'm going to do is trim away everything extra. I've got a friction fine liner here. I'm going to go ahead and fold, mark the center, fold, mark the center. Now from that I'm going to trim 1 inch. I'm going to line up right there, and on the bottom 1 inch this way, and then I'll do 1 inch that way. I am outside the quilting. 1 inch. Go ahead and flip. I'm going to line up my 1 inch, 1 inch and 1 inch, and then you can double check on 2 inches. This is a 2.5 inch ruler. Go ahead and make sure it's all straight. Yep, that looks good. That worked out good. Let's get a look at the quilting. You can see it goes right to the edge. Now I am going to sew this together, so I'm going to lose 1/4 inch here and 1/4 inch here. So this little bit of quilting will get taken up in the seam allowance. Here I don't really have any extra. I think you would have been fine going with the smaller size if you don't want to deal with this overstitching on the floral. Either one would work in my opinion. Now I need to trim this to 5.5. Here's the 5.5 inch square. It's very handy having these rulers. If you ever get a chance or get a gift card, it's always nice to invest in rulers so you have different shapes and sizes. One of the things you can do if you pick this longer design, let's say I want to make sure I get as much of this leaf and flower as possible, I could trim it close to that end. I'm going to center and trim it. That way I get rid of all that tape. I was so worried about picking out that tape, I didn't realize I was going to trim it. So again, we're trimming to 5.5 by 2. So 5.5 inch ruler. I can see that I've trimmed 2 inches. Here is stripe number 1. I have some of these pins that I wrote numbers on with a Sharpie. I want to make sure I keep my stripes in order. I don't mess up again. This is stripe number 1. There we go. Stripe number 1. Let's cut stripe number 2. Going to do the same thing. Let's get rid of all the extra stabilizer first. This is easy to see the halfway point. It's got that line that runs right down the middle. I'm pretty sure that's halfway. I can check. You can do this and look at 1 inch. That looks good, and I can see where the 2 inch line is. Yep, that's good. I'm going to line my 1 inch up with this line here and this line here. You can fold it in half too. This block doesn't have any overstitching like the floral. Here's my 5.5-inch ruler. I'm going to lose something. I was all excited because it's stitched right to the edge, but I am going to lose something with this. So I need to decide what I want to lose. Do I want to lose a little bit of this star point or some of the A? Let's look. I know I'm going to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Let's say I don't want to lose any of the star. I'm already short fabric on that end. I can see that. My fabric ends right there. That's as close as I can get. I'm going to lose a little bit of that tip. But do you see this where the A is? Let me pick it up. That's completely going to get swallowed up. I think I'd like to make sure that I keep this part of the A. Let's look. This is 5.5 inches. I've got a 1/4 inch line right there. So if I trim here, I'll lose that little bit there. I'm going to lose some of the star no matter what. Do you see that? I'm going to lose the point. I'm going to split the difference. I'll lose a little star, a little A, and it'll be fine. I'm going to go ahead and center that, and I'll go ahead and trim. Mark this number 2, and let's cut 3 and 4. Let's move on to stripe number 3. We need to trim it to 8.5 by 2. I'm going to start with the 2. This one I will fold in half and mark. I'm going to match up my fabric corners, mark the halfway point, do the same thing here, just like I did before, and then I'm going to trim 1 inch on either side. This we need to trim to 8.5 inches long. I have a ruler for that. I have a ruler that's 8.5 inches wide. I've been collecting rulers for a long time, years. Very handy, never hurts to add an extra ruler to your collection. If you see them go on sale, grab it. I'm just going to center this because this is the floral design. It doesn't matter what gets trimmed off. I am making sure I trim off my tape. Stripe number 3, mark it so you don't put it in the wrong place. Stripe number 4 conveniently has the little dash again halfway through. Going to line up and trim my inch and my inch. Let's look at this one for 8.5. I'm not going to lose anything with this one. Mark it number 4. Let's get ready to put our flag block together. It doesn't look like this goes in any particular direction. You can certainly match it to this picture with the little squiggle up here in the top left corner. Little squiggle, top left corner. Here's how everything lays out. Our first step is sewing 1 and 2 together. So you'll put them right sides together. Sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I would press that seam open. Then this will sew onto that. And again, remember there's going to be a seam allowance here. So that will fit. You'll put right sides together, sew it, and then I would press it open again. There's a lot of bulk in here. And then you can either sew these 2 together and sew the 2 pieces together, or you could sew that to that piece and that to that piece. I'm going to go ahead and stitch everything. I'm not going to record that. It's got great pictures in the instructions. I'm going to go stitch everything together, and then we'll do a close-up and we'll see how the quilting turns out. We're all sewn together. Let's look at a couple of things. If you remember, you have a choice of 2 or 2.5, 2.5 or 3. I can actually see this is circled. I believe this was the one that I used. I wanted to make sure the width was quilted. Here's how it turned out when it's sewn in the block. You can see the big flower here. Some of it's in the seam. Some of the leaves are in the seam, and right there. If you don't like that look, you can pick the smaller file. Instead of using the 2.5 or 3, you can go up and use the one for 2 or 2.5 and go across and use, I think it's 1.5 by 7B instead. Completely up to you. Same thing here. You could have picked the file that wasn't quite as wide. When I was sewing these together, I did notice they were a bit slippy. I have one of these purple things, and I use this to help keep the top fabric down and guiding it through under my presser foot, because this backing, the stabilizer, just slips under my presser foot. So be careful when you sew. Sew it slow, give yourself some time. I did press everything open. I put my clappers on top of it. I want to make sure it's nice and flat. As far as the 2 stripes with the words, this one's great. I have enough seam allowance here and here. I'm not going to lose anything. You can see I lost a little bit of the A right here, and I'm going to lose a little bit of this star when I stitch it into the quilt. Does it matter, in my opinion? No, it looks fine. Nobody's going to stand this close to your quilt unless you're taking it to some kind of event to be judged. Let's look at all of our blocks and what we're going to do next time. Here's all of our blocks for this week. That was a lot of work. We have our 3 8-point stars and our flag block. Join me the week of June 16th. We're going to be working on some filler blocks and the left and right border. I'd love to know if you found this video helpful. Please let me know. I'm also adding perfectly pieced to my videos. I started with the bird block. I have an intro video posted showing what you get with the digital version, and I need some help picking a project. I'll link that video below as well. Check it out. We only have a few more weeks left in the Star Spangled Beauty Quilt Along. Give yourself a pat on the back for these. These were a little bit difficult, a little more involved. Thanks for watching. See you next time.